going on in here?
What's the name of Nickelback?
Nickel what?
My new favorite band.
No! Wolfgang, no, you can't do this to me. I raised you better than this.
But it's
No,
Nickelback.
you're breaking your mother's heart, son. You can't play Nickelback in this household. Get out. Get out. I can't stop thinking about what happened with him earlier. It was... I don't know where I went wrong as a father. I tried to raise him right. I tried to raise him on real rock and roll, real punk rock, but it just, I went wrong somewhere along the way. I'll always love my son, but it's gonna be really hard to get used to this. He's a Nickelback fan.
It's been a while, YouTube, but I'm here now because there was something on my mind that I just had to get off my chest. See, I was sitting, as one does, when the Nickelback song came on. And as I listened to them for the first time in probably a decade, I began to ponder, why were they so hated? The music wasn't really all that bad. They won countless of Society of Composers, Authors, and Music Publishers of Canada awards, which is a terrible, terrible name for an award. They had countless Billboard Top 10 hits and were a huge commercial success overall, which coincidentally brings me to the theory that I have formulated with my mind on why Nickelback was so despised. You see, in order to understand the hate for Nickelback, you first have to travel back to the early 90s. In Seattle, grunge had become the new face of punk rock, with bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, The Melvins, and Green River, just to name a few. And we all know grunge, we all know how Kurt died, and how pretty much all of the other frontmen, aside from maybe Eddie Vedder, ended up with a crippling addiction of some sort, and in turn created lyrics that were extremely dark and moody, but also surprisingly relatable for angsty teens and burnout adults alike. You see, if you listen to Nickelback or Pearl Jam or Nirvana with an untrained ear and no prior knowledge of them, you might just think they were all basically the same genre, right? Wrong! The difference between them goes beyond the sound and beyond anything that you'd comprehend with the naked eye. Because after grunge's explosion in the 90s, we saw countless imitation bands coming forward to try and capitalize off the Seattle sound. Bands like Godsmack and Disturbed, both bands that were inspired by Alice in Chains, for lack of a better term. And there was a plethora of bands also influenced by Nirvana, naturally. Puddle of Mudd and Nickelback were the two biggest ones that I could think of. Which led me to my theory on Nickelback. You see, in my opinion, their original sin was basically just them being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And of course, that's a grossly oversimplified way of saying it, but if you break it down, it starts to make sense. You see, Nickelback was formed in 1995, a year after the death of Kurt Cobain, when the grunge scene was already on the decline. Nirvana was over. Alice in Chains released their final album with Lane Staley and their final album of the 90s, and Soundgarden was in the process of recording their final album of the 90s as well. All of the big players in the grunge game were winding down and finishing up, while Nickelback was just getting started. But them being Canadian pretty boys with a polished sound led people to feel like Nickelback just didn't really belong to the same subculture as the other rock bands of the time. By 1995, the record companies had already been capitalizing on the grunge sound, removing the punk energy and making it sterile. And if there's one word I would use to describe Nickelback, it would be sterile. Despite the fact that they wrote hit songs repeatedly, there was no danger behind it. There didn't seem to be anything relatable about them to the traditional fans of the genre. It was safe, it was radio-friendly, it was non-controversial, which were all things that rock had never really been before. They took rock in a more of a corporate direction, which is great for business, but terrible for rebellion and street cred, if you will. And this was really when rock began to dwindle, because in order to make a genre thrive, I have to quote my godfather, Finn McKenty, you need women and teens to have a thriving genre. And Nickelback could draw crowds of women in their 30s and 40s, which is nothing wrong with that, but it couldn't attract the young, hip audience required for success. You see, teens want something that feels unacceptable, that makes their parents scared, and Nickelback was none of that. It felt like Nirvana if Nirvana had gone to rehab and converted to Catholicism. It had no edge, it had no feeling, it had no spark. And what the fuck is music if it has no feeling? In my opinion, if Nickelback had been formed in 1991 in Seattle and maybe had a crippling heroin addiction, they probably could have ended up being one of the biggest grunge bands up there, right next to the Big Four. And don't at me, bro. Don't at me, bro. And all of this got me to thinking rock never really was the same after the death of grunge. It had a slight resurgence with nu metal and then My Chemical Romance style of emo, but it has never again become a cultural phenomenon like it did before. So, did Nickelback kill rock? Or were they more of like an angel of death, not really directly responsible, but merely a sign of a genre in decline? Now, I personally don't think they were responsible. Obviously, if they were a terrible band, they would never have gotten as big as they were. If people genuinely hated them, it would not have been played on the radio constantly like it was. And because of that, I really don't think that they were hated at all, per se. What people hated was what they symbolized. They were a symbol of the time changing and the culture changing. In essence, they were the angel of death, symbolizing the beginning of the end of the genre's relevancy. And so far that's been true. I don't know. I've never been a Nickelback fan. The only person who I've ever even met who was a Nickelback fan was like this 6-year-old kid that lived across from me in my neighborhood growing up. And it was like the only rock band his mom would let him listen to, which again kind of lends itself to my point. They didn't have what most people had become accustomed to as far as rock goes. You know, that wow factor, that edge, you know? Anyway, let me know down in the comments what you think. Was Nickelback responsible for the death of rock? Or were they really as bad as we thought? Find out next week on the next episode of... I forgot the name of my channel.